Assalamu alaikum and welcome to English podcast discussion with Dr. Maqsood Azeemi, which was held on 28 August 2025. Welcome to the deep dive. You've provided us with some really incredibly rich material today, and we're embarking on a journey into these profound concepts that touch upon how we understand information, spirituality, and, well, our role in the world. Have you ever wondered if the spiritual texts we hold sacred contain a kind of hidden science, maybe, waiting to be rediscovered? Our mission today is really to unpack these insights, bringing clarity to ideas that can profoundly impact how you navigate your daily life.
Indeed. And it's fascinating stuff. We'll be exploring the subtle yet really crucial differences in spiritual terminology, words we hear often but maybe don't fully grasp. We'll also look at the nuanced nature of prophecy and prediction and delve into the revolutionary approach to spirituality by Qalandar Baba Auliya. And beyond that, we'll examine the transformative power of collective thinking, try to understand maybe why we face collective consequences for our actions, and ultimately grasp the true active meaning of a sound heart, what's called Qalbi Salim. These aren't just, theoretical discussions floating in the air. They offer really practical guidance for transforming your understanding and your lived experience.
Okay, so let's dive right in and unpack this with some foundational terms from our sources. We should probably begin with the words Basharat and Nazeer. Now, these words are often heard in spiritual and religious contexts, right? And while many might have a general idea, our sources highlight a deeper, more precise distinction that, well, is often missed. What truly separates these two concepts?
That's an excellent starting point because, as the source material makes clear, the common understanding is often incomplete or sometimes even skewed. The word Basharat, it comes from the Arabic root Bashar, which fundamentally just means to give news. Simple enough, right? But in everyday conversation, especially in many cultures, it's almost exclusively used to mean good news or glad tidings. We automatically associate it with something positive.
Right, like hearing good news about a job or something.
Exactly. But its core, its more expansive meaning is simply the news that is received, or maybe more accurately, the news that is given regarding future events. It doesn't inherently carry a positive or negative connotation in itself. It's just information about what is to come. The quality of goodness comes from the content of that news, not from the word Basharat itself. It's really about a foretelling, a communication of something that hasn't yet occurred.
Okay, so if I'm getting this right, it's about any foretelling, any communication of future events, but we've sort of historically flavored it with positivity, maybe narrowed its true scope. That's a subtle but really significant distinction. And I can see how that might lead to misinterpretations down the line.
Yeah.
Can you give us an example from the sources, something that make this clearer?
Certainly. To illustrate this directly from the source material, think about the historical accounts of previous prophets. Prophets like Abraham or Moses, peace be upon them. They gave Basharat foretellings about the eventual arrival of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Now, in this specific context, because the news was about the coming of a great spiritual guide, a mercy for all the worlds, it was indeed perceived as good news, a joyous proclamation. So naturally, it was termed Basharat. But the critical point, the takeaway here, is that the word itself signifies the act of conveying news about a future event. The goodness was in the content of that specific news, the arrival of the final prophet. It wasn't an inherent property of the word Basharat. Understanding this distinction helps us appreciate the precision of spiritual language. It's not just a happy announcement. It's a piece of, well, divine intelligence about the future being shared.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, so Basharat is the broader act of conveying news about the future, which can be positive, absolutely, but it isn't inherently so. So what about Nazeer? I've always associated it very strongly with warnings, suggesting it's kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum. Is that generally accurate?
You're absolutely right in that association, yes. And it really helps to highlight the clear contrast between the two terms. Nazeer, which comes from the Arabic root nun zal re, specifically refers to warning or admonition. It's a heads up, essentially. The source material highlights its usage in the Quran itself, like in the phrase am lam tunzirum, which translates to whether you warn them or not. This clearly indicates a caution, a notice of potential negative consequences, a call to be alert to impending danger or perhaps an undesirable outcome if things don't change. So while Basharat is about information, often neutral in its delivery form, Nazeer is about information with a very specific purpose, to deter from harm, to warn.
Okay, so if I'm understanding this correctly, Basharat is like opening a window to the future, maybe often with a sense of hope or expectation, like the coming of a prophet. While Nazeer is more like sounding an alarm bell, focusing on potential dangers or negative outcomes if a certain path is followed or if warnings are ignored. So the distinction isn't merely about good news versus bad news, but maybe more about the intent behind the communication, informing versus cautioning.
Exactly. You've grasped the core difference there. There's a clear and, I think, critical distinction. It's about the function of the message. When prophets speak of the day of judgment, for instance, or of the consequences of rejecting divine guidance and divine laws, those are invariably presented as a Nazeer. It's a warning. It's not a Basharat. The intent is clearly to make people aware of potential harm, to guide them away from actions that lead to detrimental outcomes, and hopefully to inspire a change in behavior or direction. This understanding is crucial because it shows us how divine communication serves these dual purposes: to inform us of blessings and opportunities, Basharat when the news is good, and also to caution us against pitfalls, Nazeer. Without this clarity, we might misinterpret divine messages. We might dismiss warnings just as bad news rather than understanding them as vital, potentially life-saving guidance.
That brings us beautifully to the broader concept of prediction, which seems to encompass both Basharat and Nazeer in a way. Our sources discuss that there are actually 3 distinct types of predictions. This is where it gets really interesting, I think, as it broadens our understanding of how information about the future is conveyed, and maybe, more importantly, how reliable it might be. What are these types?
Indeed. A prediction, just at its basic level, is simply giving information about future situations or events. But as you hinted, its source and its reliability can vary quite significantly. According to the source material, predictions can originate in 3 distinct ways. The first is based on conjecture or estimation. In Arabic and Urdu, this is often referred to as qiyas or andaza. This is essentially guesswork. It could be an unverified assumption or just a personal assessment based on very limited information, or sometimes even just a gut feeling.
Like guessing the lottery numbers, or predicting rain just because the sky looks a bit gray.
Pretty much, yes. Or think of it like having a hunch about how a sports game will turn out without knowing much about the teams. Or a friend making an educated guess about traffic conditions without actually checking a map or traffic report. It's simply saying, well, I guess this might happen, or it feels like this is how things will go without any substantial backing, without real data. The reliability of such a prediction is naturally very low.
Okay, so pure speculation mostly, maybe sometimes with a thin veneer of reasoning, but no real backing or scientific method behind it. What's the next level up then?
Well, not always pure speculation, but certainly far from certainty. The second type is what the source calls knowledge-based estimation. This is where you use your intellect, your accumulated knowledge, your experience, data you've gathered, your understanding of patterns to estimate what might happen. For example, a meteorologist predicts tomorrow's weather. They're using current atmospheric conditions, historical data, complex computer models. It's based on knowledge.
Right, or like a financial analyst predicting market trends using economic indicators and past performance.
Exactly. They might say, okay, given what I know about this situation based on these specific factors, it could happen this way. Or there's a high probability of this outcome. This is far more informed and reasoned than a mere conjecture, definitely. But it still relies on an intellectual assessment of probabilities, not absolute certainties. It's a calculated projection, still subject to variables and, unforeseen circumstances that can throw the whole thing off.
And the third type, I imagine, is the most robust, the most certain, the one that embodies what we might traditionally call true prophecy.
Absolutely. This is the highest form. It's the most reliable, the most irrefutable. This is a fact-based prediction. These predictions aren't derived from guesswork or probabilities based on limited human knowledge. They're derived from established facts, from undeniable truths, or, crucially, in the context of divine communication, from divine knowledge itself. This is the category into which true divine prophecies fall. They are not based on human estimation, however educated. They're not based on calculating probabilities. They are based on absolute certainty. They are declarations of what will happen because the source of the knowledge, Allah, is beyond the limitations of time and human understanding.
That distinction is absolutely crucial. It moves us from the realm of possibility, however likely, into the realm of certainty. Can you give us a powerful example from the source, something that really demonstrates this level of divine certainty?
Certainly. The Quran itself provides compelling examples. For instance, it contains prophecies that foretold the fall of the Roman and Persian empires. Now, think about the time of their revelation. These were the 2 superpowers of the known world. seemingly unshakable, vast, powerful empires. To predict their demise, sometimes mentioning specific circumstances or time frames, wasn't just guesswork. It wasn't even a knowledge-based estimation based on observable trends at the time. No human analyst could have predicted that with certainty. It was a fact-based prophecy revealed by Allah, who possesses absolute knowledge of all past, present, and future events. And history, of course, confirms these predictions came to pass, often in astonishing detail that defied conventional expectations.
That's powerful. Are there more personal examples, perhaps involving individuals?
Yes. Another powerful anecdote from the source material illustrates this on a more personal level. It's the prophecy Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, made to a man named Suraqah. During the Hijrah, the migration to Medina, Suraqah was actually pursuing the Prophet and Abu Bakr, hoping to capture them for a reward offered by the Quraysh. As Suraqah drew near, the Prophet, seeing him in this state of pursuit, told him something incredible. He said, essentially, Suraqah, how will you feel when you wear the bracelets of Kisra? Kisra being the title of the Persian emperor. Now imagine this. Suraqah was a Bedouin tribesman chasing the Prophet for a bounty. The Persian Empire was immensely powerful. The idea that Suraqah would ever wear the emperor's personal bracelet seemed completely improbable, almost absurd at that moment.
Utterly unbelievable from a human perspective.
Exactly. Yet it was a fact-based prediction. It was a Peshin going, a divine foretelling. It wasn't a guess, it was a statement of future fact. And indeed, history records that much later, during the Caliphate of Umar ibn al-Khattab, when the Persian Empire was conquered by the Muslims, those very bracelets of Kisra were brought to Medina as part of the spoils of war. Caliph Umar remembered the Prophet's words, called for Suraqah, who was by then an old man, and had him wear the bracelets, fulfilling the prophecy down to the letter. These examples beautifully illustrate predictions rooted in ultimate truth, not human speculation or probability.
Wow, that's an amazing story. So if we connect all this back, Basharat, Nazeer, and Peshin, they all relate to information about the future. Basharat often implies good news, but is fundamentally just news about the future. Nazeer is specifically a warning, and Peshin is a general term for foretelling, which can encompass both and crucially can be derived from these different levels: conjecture, knowledge-based estimation, or divine fact. What this really highlights for me is the depth and precision of spiritual language and how carefully we need to interpret these concepts, moving beyond just a surface-level understanding.
Precisely. The terms aren't interchangeable, and understanding their specific nuances gives us a much richer appreciation for the messages they convey, especially in sacred texts. It's about discerning the source, the intent, and the reliability of information about the future, especially when it comes to divine guidance. It really encourages us to ask, where is this information coming from? Is this a guess, an educated projection, or is it a divinely revealed certainty? And that's a question relevant far beyond just spiritual texts, isn't it?
Absolutely. It applies to so much information we encounter daily. Okay, this discussion leads us beautifully into another fascinating distinction mentioned in the source material: Mutashabihat and Muhkamat in divine texts. For many of us, these might be new terms, or perhaps we've heard them thrown around without fully grasping their profound significance. What exactly are these concepts, and why is the difference between them so crucial when we engage with sacred texts and try to seek deeper understanding?
Right. So what does this all mean for us, for anyone trying to engage with spiritual wisdom? Let's start with Muhkamat. Muhkamat refers to verses or concepts within divine texts, like the Quran, that are clear, consolidated, unambiguous, and directly comprehensible to our intellect. Our minds accept them pretty much as they are, without needing layers of symbolic or allegorical interpretation. Think of them as the bedrock principles, the unambiguous commands, the straightforward statements, the foundational truths that are universally understood and directly applicable.
Like basic commandments: pray, be just, be kind to parents, things like that.
Exactly. Direct commands to establish prayer, to be just in dealings, to treat parents with kindness, or core theological statements like the absolute oneness of God. These are generally considered Muhkamat. Their meaning is intended to be firm, clear, and foundational. They provide the fixed points of reference in our spiritual understanding, leaving very little room for misinterpretation if read sincerely.
Okay, that seems clear enough. The foundational, unambiguous parts. So Mutashabihat then must be the opposite, the more metaphorical, maybe allegorical, or even seemingly enigmatic verses that our immediate, logical, or material mind often struggles with.
Exactly, you've got it. Mutashabihat comes from the Arabic root shaba, which means resemblance or analogy. These are verses or concepts that serve as examples, similes, or metaphors for our intellect. They point towards deeper realities. The key challenge here, and the pitfall for many people, is that when we try to interpret them solely through our logical, material, or sensory understanding, basically, trying to make them fit perfectly with our physical observations and everyday experiences, we often miss their true, deeper spiritual meaning. Our minds instinctively try to consolidate them with what we physically observe in the world, but they don't always align neatly. This mismatch can lead to confusion, an incomplete picture, or even very literal misinterpretations that can sometimes sound illogical or fantastical if viewed from a purely material perspective.
Okay. This sounds like where many misunderstandings or overly literal interpretations might stem from, potentially causing unnecessary confusion, debate, or even skepticism for some people. Can you give us a specific example from the source material that really illustrates this critical distinction between Muhkamat and Mutashabihat?
A perfect example, and one the source uses effectively, is the description of rivers in paradise found in the Quran. The descriptions that speak of rivers of milk, rivers of honey, rivers of wine, and rivers of clear water. Now, if we rely solely on our physical observation, or everyday experience with what the source calls Mutashabihat, these descriptions simply don't consolidate. They don't compute with our physical reality. We haven't seen rivers of actual milk or wine flowing naturally in the physical world. And while we've certainly seen rivers of water, the source notes they are very rarely of that perfectly transparent clarity described, often carrying sediment or being murky. So if we take these descriptions strictly literally, trying to picture actual rivers of these substances, our material minds struggle to reconcile them with reality. This can lead to puzzlement, maybe even dismissal as mere fantasy. This is precisely the realm of Mutashabihat.
Right. So the human mind, kind of limited by its material experience, forms an incomplete or even a misleading picture if it tries to literally conceptualize these descriptions solely within its known physical framework. It just doesn't fit. How then are we meant to understand them, if not literally, what's the approach?
Absolutely. The source explains that Nahr, the Arabic word for river, in this context isn't meant to be understood as a literal physical river in the way we experience it materially. Instead, it's presented as a powerful metaphor, an istera, which signifies a continuous flow, a perpetual supply line, what in Urdu might be described as supply line jari rahe, meaning the supply line remains constantly running. The phrase rivers flowing beneath them, Tajri, Katihal Anhar, which is repeated so often in Quranic descriptions of paradise, indicates a continuous dissemination of resources, an unending supply of blessings, a constant state of abundance and provision, rather than actual physical rivers as we understand them on earth. The milk, honey, wine, water, these represent different types of pure, unceasing spiritual nourishment and delight, tailored to the perfected state of being in paradise. The problem arises when we, as humans, relying solely on our material understanding, encounter such verses. Our minds often fail to form a clear, accurate picture because we're stuck on the literal image. We get hung up on the physical impossibility, and thus these verses get labeled as Mutashabihat, because their true, profound spiritual meaning isn't being grasped by that limited material lens. It requires a shift, a move beyond the literal to the metaphorical, from the physical form to the spiritual essence being conveyed.
This raises a really important question for all of us listening, doesn't it? How often do we get stuck on the literal meaning of things, not just in scripture, but maybe in life, in poetry, in symbolism, and miss the profound spiritual or metaphorical truths simply because our material experience doesn't seem to match the description? It really encourages us to think beyond the obvious, doesn't it? To engage with texts and maybe even life experiences on a much deeper level than just the surface.
That's a great point. What's truly fascinating here is that this isn't just about interpreting ancient texts or religious scriptures. This tendency we have to interpret everything through a material filter, through what our five senses tell us, affects our understanding of many concepts in life. If we connect this to the bigger picture, it highlights the inherent limitations of our perception when we restrict ourselves only to what we can physically see, touch, taste, smell, or logically deduce within our material existence. It really calls for a deeper, perhaps more intuitive engagement with information, a willingness to see beyond the surface appearance. When we encounter something that doesn't quite fit our established material framework, labeling it Mutashabihat shouldn't be a dismissal. It should be an invitation.
An invitation to what?
An invitation to seek a higher, more profound meaning. It's a recognition, really, that some truths, some realities operate on a different dimension, a different level of existence than the purely physical one we inhabit day to day. It signals that deeper interpretation is required.
That's a profound connection. So what's really eye-opening here is how these allegorical verses, or maybe even experiences that seem confusing, which might once have been seen as enigmatic or even contradictory, could actually be guideposts. guideposts to a higher form of knowledge, if only we train ourselves to look beyond the literal interpretation. They invite us into a deeper realm of understanding, rather than just serving as puzzles to be solved or dismissed by our limited physical senses. This truly shifts our perspective on how to approach wisdom.
Exactly. And, this brings us quite naturally to a pivotal figure mentioned in our discussion source, Qalandar Baba Auliya. Our source material describes his actual achievement, his pioneering work, and how he essentially elevated spirituality to the status of a science. Now, okay, let's unpack this, because that sounds like a truly revolutionary concept, especially for our modern era, which prizes science so highly.
It does sound revolutionary, spirituality as a science. What's truly fascinating here is that the source states Qalandar Baba Auliya's core achievement, his real pioneering work, was precisely this: systematizing spiritual knowledge in such a way that it attained the status of a science. This seems like a crucial distinction. You mentioned earlier that before him, much of this profound spiritual understanding was primarily ilmisina, literally, knowledge of the chest. Can you elaborate a bit more on what ilmisina truly meant and why it was primarily confined in this way?
That's right. And if we define science, at its heart, what is it? It's about organizing knowledge, classifying it, systematizing it in a way that is potentially repeatable, perhaps testable in its own framework, and certainly communicable in a structured way. Before Qalandar Baba Auliya's work, this profound spiritual understanding, this ilmisina, was often passed down through a very selective, sometimes secretive, and intensely personal method. It went from a qualified teacher, a murshid, directly to only a chosen few students, those deemed ready. It was considered esoteric knowledge, meant only for those with specific spiritual capacities, a deep inclination towards the divine, and who had undergone rigorous training and self-purification. Now, the reasons for the secrecy, as the source explains, were multifaceted. Part of it was protective. Those who genuinely lead people towards Allah often face opposition, historically and perhaps spiritually, from forces that actively work to prevent the dissemination of such transformative knowledge, often through persecution, distortion, or sowing confusion. So secrecy was a way to preserve the purity of the knowledge. But of course, it also inherently limited its accessibility to the wider population.
So it implies there was almost a dual education system operating, maybe even right from the time of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. A public one for general guidance, and a more private, intensive one for selected individuals who were deemed ready for this deeper inner knowledge.
Precisely. The source material details how Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, actually implemented a kind of dual education system that addressed different levels of spiritual understanding and development among his companions. You have the public teachings, delivered from the mosque and the pulpit. These focused on sermons, evangelism, general guidance for the masses, you could say, the Muhkamat of daily life, the basic principles of faith and practice. But then there was also a more private, intensive training system for selected companions. Most notably, the Suffah, who resided in or near the Prophet's mosque, often in dedicated spaces, sometimes referred to historically as Khanqahs, or spiritual centers. These were just dormitories. They were essentially specialized spiritual academies. Students, companions, would stay there for extended periods, sometimes a year, 2 years, even 4, undergoing profound spiritual training, intense self-purification, tazkiyah, and receiving direct instruction from the Prophet himself. After this intensive training, they were often sent out to teach and guide others. This deeper esoteric knowledge, nurtured and transmitted in these more private, protected settings, became what we call ilmisina, knowledge held within the spiritual lineage, passed from heart to heart, mastered to disciple.
It sounds like an incredibly rich tradition, a really powerful method for preserving and transmitting profound wisdom directly. But the source also alludes to a period of significant loss, or maybe suppression, of this specific knowledge after that initial foundational era. What happened to this ilmisina? Why didn't it become more widespread earlier?
Sadly, yes, that's a key part of the historical context provided. After the era of the Prophet and the rightly guided caliphs, as the Islamic world expanded into a vast empire, there followed periods marked by considerable internal conflict, political turmoil, power struggles, and sometimes widespread persecution of certain groups. This upheaval led to the tragic loss, or in some cases, the deliberate suppression, of much of this true connecting spiritual knowledge, the knowledge that linked individuals directly to the divine reality. Many learned individuals, particularly those closest to the Prophet's household and his direct lineage, who were seen as carriers of this deep inner understanding, were unfortunately martyred, exiled, or marginalized during these conflicts. The source gives a striking, albeit perhaps historically debated, example to illustrate the scale. It mentions that at the time of the conquest of Mecca, some 80,000 Ansar, the Prophet's helpers from Medina, were reported present. Yet today, how many of their names do we collectively remember? How much of their direct spiritual lineage and teachings do we commonly trace? Perhaps Abu Ayyub al-Ansari stands out, largely because he later sought refuge in what is now Turkey, and his tomb there preserved his memory prominently. This example, regardless of exact numbers, illustrates the extent to which the genuine, linking knowledge to Allah was often sidelined, scattered, or lost amidst political power struggles, the rise of dynasties, sectarian conflicts, and the actions of those the source might term enemies of knowledge. Over time, people also began to categorize this knowledge in increasingly rigid ways, giving specific, almost exclusive labels like Wali Allah, friend of God, Qutub, spiritual access, Gauth, succorer. While these terms have meanings within Sufi cosmology, their common usage sometimes had the effect of limiting this knowledge, making it seem like it belonged only to a select, often inaccessible few, rather than understanding it as a potential science, a methodology applicable to all sincere seekers.
So this crucial spiritual science, the very knowledge that connected people directly to their creator and to deeper truths about existence, was essentially veiled or obscured from the masses for many centuries. How did it then reemerge? And why, according to the source, at this particular point in history, was it a kind of divine intervention, a timing precisely aligned with human evolution or readiness?
What's truly fascinating here, and central to the source's perspective, is that it's described not as a random rediscovery, but as a precise, divinely ordained arrangement, a conscious timing by the Creator. Allah, in His infinite wisdom, seeing the unfolding need for humanity's spiritual progress, especially in an age marked by the accelerated advancement of material sciences, physics, chemistry, biology, psychology, etc., which were significantly strengthening and expanding human consciousness, but primarily in the material realm prepared for the redissemination of this complementary spiritual science. Human consciousness, the source argues, began to mature collectively to a point where it was no longer just seeking physical strength or purely mental development. There was a growing, undeniable yearning emerging across cultures, a search for deeper spiritual progress, for meaning beyond the material, for a reconnection with the divine source. This turn, or quota, which implies a divinely appointed lot or task, the specific responsibility of bringing this profound, systematized spiritual knowledge back into the open, in a structured, scientific, and accessible way suitable for the modern age, this task fell to Qalandar Baba Auliya. It was presented as a spiritual mandate for a new era, recognizing humanity's potential readiness for a more comprehensive, integrated understanding of existence, one that harmonized the material and the spiritual.
So he was, in essence, commissioned, tasked with bringing this profound spiritual understanding back into the open, but crucially, in a systematic and accessible way, almost like receiving a divine mandate tailored for a new era of human consciousness. That's a huge undertaking.
Absolutely, that's the perspective presented. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, is said to have personally instructed him in a spiritual capacity to make his specific way of thinking, his distinct intellectual framework, what the source terms his tartsific, accessible to all humanity. This wasn't about inventing something new or developing a new interpretation based on personal opinion. The mission, as described, was about restoring the original, correct, and scientific understanding of spiritual realities and sciences, making them comprehensible and relatable to the modern mind, which was increasingly thinking in scientific terms. This monumental task, this divine assignment, led directly to the creation of his seminal work, the book Loh-o-Qalam, which translates to the tablet and the pen.
The creation of such a foundational text, Loh-o-Qalam, a book intended to outline an entire spiritual science, must have been an absolutely incredible undertaking. Can you describe the effort involved in compiling it, according to the source?
It truly was an immense, deeply dedicated effort, spanning a significant period of his life, according to the accounts. The actual compilation of Loh-o-Qalam took a concentrated period of about 2.5 to 3 years. Qalandar Baba Auliya would meticulously write it down in the quiet early hours of the morning, typically after performing the voluntary late-night tahajjud prayers, and he would continue writing until after the Fajr dawn prayer. This wasn't merely an intellectual exercise of collating information. It's portrayed as an intense, often solitary and divinely guided effort to document these profound spiritual truths, drawing directly from his own deep spiritual experiences, insights, and what is described as divine inspiration or dictation. It required immense spiritual discipline, unwavering focus, and a direct living connection to the source of that knowledge. However, even after the writing was complete, the journey of bringing this knowledge to the public was fraught with practical challenges.
I can only imagine. The practical challenges in disseminating such complex, perhaps even esoteric material must have been significant, especially in an era before modern publishing, digital media, and widespread literacy in these specific kinds of topics.
Indeed, the source highlights this struggle. It actually took another 8 to 10 years after the writing was finished for the book to even be formally published. During those intervening years, long before the age of photocopiers or digital printing made replication easy, Qalandar Baba Auliya himself physically copied the entire book by hand multiple times. He did this for those few individuals who actively sought it out, those he deemed ready and sincere enough to receive it. This act alone shows his profound dedication to its propagation, despite the difficulties. Then, when Loh-o-Qalam was finally published sometime around the 1980s, a new kind of challenge emerged. Human consciousness, perhaps still accustomed to the earlier, more secretive, sometimes mystical, or personality-focused nature of spiritual knowledge transmission, initially struggled with its scientific and systematic approach. It was often labeled an ilhami kitab, a divinely inspired book, but in a way that implied it was suitable only for special, inherently spiritually advanced individuals, not for the average person seeking understanding. It wasn't seen as a universal textbook, a science for all. This perception, unfortunately, led to its initial neglect by the very people it was intended to benefit. Many people apparently purchased it out of reverence for its author, treating it as a blessed object, baraka, who keep safely in their homes, rather than actively engaging with its content as a practical textbook of spiritual science meant to be studied and applied.
That's quite a hurdle, isn't it? A book meant to be a universal science, initially perceived by many as only for a select elite few. But the legacy, as the source mentions, didn't just stop there with that initial challenge, did it? His spiritual successor played an absolutely crucial role in bridging that gap.
Not at all. The story continues, and this is vital. Recognizing this gap, the profound systematized knowledge contained within Loh-o-Qalam on one hand, and the public's difficulty in accessing or comprehending it on the other. Qalandar Baba Auliya's designated spiritual successor, Murshid Karim, Khwaja Shamsuddin Azeemi, took on the immense task of making Loh-o-Qalam truly accessible to a wider audience. He dedicated decades of his life to this specific mission. According to the source, he wrote almost 100 books, numerous articles, and delivered countless lectures specifically dedicated to explaining, clarifying, elaborating, and elucidating the profound teachings contained within Loh-o-Qalam. These supplementary works broke down the complex concepts, provided relatable analogies, offered practical guidance, addressed common questions, and essentially acted as a comprehensive commentary or user's manual to unlock the spiritual science for a broader audience, step by step. This is a truly monumental effort, spanning decades, aimed at ensuring that this spiritual science, this parapsychology as the source sometimes terms it, could genuinely reach, resonate with, and ultimately transform human consciousness on a larger scale.
This raises an important question then. How does the spiritual science, or parapsychology as the source terms it, connect with our modern understanding of the human experience, especially now in the 21st century? And how does it relate back to that earlier discussion about Mutashabihat, the allegorical verses?
This leads to a crucial and very contemporary point, I think. The source suggests that today, human consciousness, generally speaking, has matured enough, or is at least beginning to mature enough, to consciously care for all three fundamental levels of being: the physical, the mental, and the spiritual. We're increasingly seeing that people aren't just seeking physical strength or purely intellectual development anymore. There's a growing yearning, a deeper search, often surfacing in various forms, for spiritual progress, for purpose, for meaning beyond the material accumulation or fleeting pleasures. The term parapsychology is used, as the source implies, precisely because this knowledge goes beyond conventional psychology. Conventional psychology primarily deals with the mind, emotions, observable behavior, often within a largely material or biochemical framework. Parapsychology, in this specific context, signifies a science that encompasses the vital, often neglected spiritual dimension of human existence. It explores phenomena, principles, and inner faculties like intuition, spiritual insight, the nature of the soul that are beyond what mainstream psychology typically addresses. It's about understanding the entirety of the human being, the non-physical aspects, as well as the physical and mental.
Okay, so this is where the previous discussion about Mutashabihat comes back into play, isn't it? It sounds like these seemingly enigmatic verses, the allegorical ones, now become vital guideposts, making much more sense within this larger scientific framework of parapsychology or spiritual science.
Absolutely. That's the connection the source makes. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the Mutashabihat in sacred texts, those concepts we discussed earlier as being difficult for the purely material mind to grasp literally were, in fact, according to this view, deliberate pointers towards these very spiritual sciences. They were clues. We often misinterpreted them or got stuck on the literal meaning, perhaps considering only the clear Muhkamat verses as truly factual and actionable, precisely because we remained confined to the material zone of understanding. We lack the framework to decode the metaphors properly. The Mutashabihat, from this perspective, were actually metaphorical keys, veiled in allegorical language, waiting for human consciousness to mature enough and for the science to be systematized, to unlock their profound spiritual meaning through a structured scientific approach. For example, the source mentions the Quranic concept of the Kitab-ul-Mubeen, the clear book. This is presented not as a physical book with pages, but as a profound spiritual reality. It's described metaphorically as a sort of divine program, a cosmic blueprint or master plan.
Like a blueprint for all creation.
Exactly. Imagine it like a divine operating system, perhaps, or a comprehensive mold of existence held within Allah's infinite knowledge, detailing the beginning, the unfolding process, the climax, and the ultimate end or purpose for all of creation. And within this grand overarching system, another concept, the Lohe-Mehfooz, preserved tablet, functions metaphorically like an immense protected database or cosmic hard drive. The source, using analogy, describes it as potentially containing something like 300 million files, with each file perhaps representing the specific laws, patterns, destinies, and evolutionary programs governing a particular universe, dimension, or realm of existence within the grander Kitab-ul-Mubeen. These are obviously deep, immense spiritual realities, non-physical and vast, being described using powerful, accessible analogies like book, tablet, pen, files that attempt to bridge the gap between our material understanding and these profound non-material truths. They are mutashabihat, pointing to deeper structures of reality.
That's a truly profound way to understand it. So these allegorical verses, these mutashabihat, which might once have seemed mysterious, maybe even fantastical or scientifically naive if taken literally, are actually being presented here as direct signposts. Signposts to a higher form of knowledge, a spiritual science, if we can only learn to move beyond purely material interpretations. It's like a hidden layer of information, a deeper dimension of meaning within the texts, becoming accessible as our collective consciousness expands and as the science itself is unveiled.
Precisely. And this spiritual science, as systematized by Qalandar Baba Auliya, has its own precise terminology, much of which is derived from the Quran itself, but organized into a coherent framework for understanding the levels of consciousness and spiritual being. You hear terms like akfa, kafi, siri, ruhi, kalbi, nafsi. These aren't just random mystical words. They are technical terms within this science, organized to teach about the different layers or faculties of human consciousness. Briefly, akfa refers to the deepest, most hidden dimension of consciousness, perhaps beyond even the subtlest thought, the point of absolute unity. Kafi relates to the subtle intellect, intuition, hidden insights. Siri represents the secret or innermost core of the heart, the chamber where divine inspirations are said to be received. Ruhi is the spirit or soul, the animating energy of life. Qalandar Baba Auliya, according to the source, clarified this often debated concept, explaining it as a specific energy, part of the command work of my Lord, Min Amri Rabbi, as mentioned in the Quran 17.85, a reality that human intellect struggled to fully define scientifically until this era of clarification provided by spiritual science. Qalbi refers to the heart's intuitive center, the seat of direct perception, spiritual feeling, and often linked to emotions, but in a deeper sense than just surface feelings. And nafsi denotes the self, the ego, the seat of desires, individual identity, and the starting point for self-awareness and purification.
So this provides a map, a structured way to understand our inner landscape.
Exactly. And while later philosophers and scholars, often influenced by Greek thought or other traditions, sometimes called this overall field of study tasawwuf or Sufism, Qalandar Baba Auliya, the source emphasizes, clarified its core essence.
Yeah.
It is the systematic study of ma'anawiyat, meaning significance, and mahiyat, essence, reality, which he fundamentally defined as relating to the Rooh spirit. This, the source declares, is the era inaugurated by Qalandar Baba Auliya, where those mutashabihat, those allegorical verses that once seemed impenetrable mysteries, can now be understood not as confusing statements, but as representing a higher degree of knowledge, a science that transcends the limitations of the purely material zone and becomes accessible through this structured spiritual science.
That's a powerful summary and recontextualization. It really seems to shift centuries of spiritual thought, moving it from potentially being perceived as purely mystical or subjective towards a systematic, potentially understandable, and applicable science.
Indeed. And it built on the foundations laid by giants who came before, of course. Think of figures like Sheikh Abdul Qadir Jilani, who played a huge role in organizing the Khanqah system for spiritual training, tirelessly striving to teach spirituality and establishing wilayat, sainthood, as a structured school of thought and practice. Or consider Sheikh Ibn Arabi, who made immense intellectual and spiritual efforts to articulate these incredibly complex metaphysical realities, leaving behind a vast body of work that scholars still study today. Yet what often happened historically, as the source suggests, was that collective ignorance, societal upheaval, political interference, or simply the difficulty of transmitting such deep knowledge accurately would suppress, dilute, or distort this understanding, preventing its widespread adoption and practice in its pure form. The systematized spiritual science, presented as Qalandar Baba Auliya's profound contribution, is offered as a vital tool for our own spiritual evolution today and for future generations. The claim is straightforward. If you engage with it, if you study its principles, if you practice its methods sincerely, then those very Mutashabihat that once seemed mysterious or confusing will gradually transform into Muhkamat. For you, they become clear, consolidated, and directly comprehensible truths within your own experience. It's presented as a path from enigma to enlightenment, a science of the spirit available now potentially to all who seek it.
Okay, let's shift gears slightly, but stay connected to these core ideas. We move now to a really powerful statement attributed to Qalandar Baba Auliya that resonates deeply, I think, with our individual and collective experience, especially in today's world, he said. Individual thought creates shakal, burden, and collective thought frees one from shakal. This is a profound idea. Okay, let's unpack this. What exactly is this shakal he's referring to? It sounds quite negative.
Yes, it is presented negatively. What's truly insightful here is that shakal, in this context, literally translates to burden, but it also carries the meaning of a rigid shape or form that restricts movement, flexibility, and perspective. It implies something heavy and confining. When we are consumed by purely individual thought, the source explains, we become entirely trapped in our own narrow circle of needs, wants, preferences, and desires. It's that incessant internal monologue, isn't it? I need to eat, I need to drink, I need to wear this, I need to live comfortably. Why didn't they listen to me? Why am I not getting what I think I deserve? What about my rights? This is highly individualistic thinking, and according to this statement, it creates a literal burden, a rigid, self-imposed limitation, a shakal on ourselves, and often, by extension, on those around us. We become fixated on our own boundaries, our own immediate concerns, our own ego gratification, making us metaphorically heavy and flexible, resistant to change, and often feeling isolated even in a crowd. This shakal is like the ego's prison cell, a self-centered approach that prevents real growth, genuine connection, and contribution to the larger good.
I can almost picture that, like carrying a heavy weight around or being stuck inside a rigid container that prevents us from flowing freely or connecting with others properly. How then does collective thought free us from this shakal, this burden?
The source offers a beautiful and incredibly simple analogy to explain this profound transformation. It's very visual. Imagine you have a glass of water and you drop some grains of sugar into it. As long as the sugar maintains its individuality, as long as each grain remains separate, distinct, and undissolved, what does it do? It simply sits at the bottom of the glass. It's a burden, in a sense. It's heavy, it's separate, it's isolated. And in that state, as individual grains, it contributes practically nothing to the whole solution beyond its mere physical presence. That's shakal, the individual grain, separate, heavy, unable to fulfill its inherent potential to sweeten. Its individual goodness, its sweetness, is locked up tightly within its own rigid form.
Okay, I see the individual grains in there, but I assume the analogy continues to illustrate the transformation that happens when that individuality is released, when it moves beyond itself.
Exactly. The power is in the transformation. Now, if you take a spoon and stir the water, what happens? The sugar begins to dissolve. It starts to lose its individual form, its rigid shakal. It breaks down its boundaries and mixes uniformly with the water. And in doing so, what's the result? It sweetens the entire solution. It ceases to be an isolated burden at the bottom and becomes an integral beneficial part of the whole. Its individual goodness, its inherent quality of sweetness, is no longer confined to its tiny self, but spreads throughout, transforming the entire body of water. Its previous individual identity is willingly released into a collective identity, and in doing so, it achieves its true purpose and potential to bring sweetness and benefit to the whole.
That's a fantastic analogy. So if we apply this to society, if we as individuals remain like those separate, undissolved grains of sugar, focused only on our own boundaries, our own desires, our own self-preservation, we remain burdened, perhaps even bitter or resentful in our isolation, contributing little to the greater good around us. But if we manage to move beyond this individualistic shakal, if we embrace collective thought, then our ideas, our virtues, our positive qualities can spread, sweetening society as a whole. This feels like a powerful call towards interconnectedness, empathy, and maybe even altruism.
Precisely. You've articulated the social application perfectly. If we remain focused solely on our individual gains, our personal boundaries, defining ourselves only by what separates us, and prioritizing our self-preservation above all else, we remain trapped in our shakal. Our good qualities, our potential virtues, our capacity for kindness, innovation, and contribution remain largely confined to ourselves, much like that undissolved sugar. They don't benefit the collective nearly as much as they could. And we see the results of this shakal thinking everywhere in society, don't we? Political polarization, where individual party loyalty or identity trumps the national good. Environmental degradation, where short-term individual or corporate profit is prioritized over long-term collective ecological health. Even simple things like a lack of neighborly cooperation or community spirit often stem from this. Each person is like a sugar grain, demanding to be recognized, served, maybe complaining about the water, but not actively contributing to sweetening it.
It becomes a society of individual demands rather than collective contribution.
Exactly. But if we can transcend this limiting, individualistic approach, if we consciously choose to embrace collective thought, which really means thinking about the well-being of the whole community, the whole society, even the whole planet, considering others' needs alongside our own, contributing our unique sweetness, our talents, our positive energy to the common good, then something transformative happens. Then our ideas, our good deeds, our very qualities of kindness, empathy, compassion, and understanding, they spread, they permeate society. They become a part of the greater good, transforming the collective environment for the better, much like how the dissolved sugar sweetens the entire body of water. It's about consciously choosing to be part of the collective solution, rather than remaining rigidly attached to our individual problems or demands. The energy that was once consumed just by maintaining that rigid individual shakal, that defensive posture, is now released and becomes available to uplift everyone.
This concept of individual versus collective responsibility and the profound consequences of prolonged self-centeredness or shakal thinking leads us almost inevitably to a crucial and often quite painful discussion point raised in the source material. The current wave of natural disasters and calamities we seem to be facing around the world with increasing frequency and intensity. Our source suggests that these are not just random occurrences, not mere acts of God in the fatalistic sense, but rather direct consequences, results stemming from past individual and collective actions and mistakes. This is, understandably, a difficult truth for many people to accept or even consider. Okay, let's try to unpack this sensitive but important point.
Indeed, it's a challenging perspective, but the source puts it forward quite directly. It raises the unavoidable question. What we are currently facing, the devastating floods, the destructive wildfires, the extreme weather events, the ecological imbalances, the widespread suffering that often follows, are these not, in large part, the direct results, the consequences of our past individual and collective mistakes? This includes our mistakes as individuals in our daily consumption patterns and choices. It includes our mistakes as a society in the values we prioritize, often materialism over sustainability. It includes mistakes made by political leaders in terms of poor planning, inadequate regulation, or lack of foresight. And it includes mistakes made by the general public, perhaps through apathy, complacency, or making demands that ignore ecological realities. The source makes it clear. From this perspective, everything that is happening has a cause, or usually multiple interacting causes. And those causes are often rooted in our previous wrongdoings, our faulty approaches to living on this planet, our repeated defiance, whether conscious or unconscious, of natural and divine laws. It's presented as a fundamental principle of cause and effect, playing out on a grand, often tragic scale.
So the idea is it's not simply bad luck striking randomly or nature being inherently malevolent, but a direct cause and effect relationship stemming from how we've lived, how we've managed or mismanaged our world, both individually and collectively over time. Can you give us a concrete example from the source material that illustrates how specific human actions lead directly to these kinds of consequences, something tangible?
Absolutely. The source provides a very common and stark example. The practice of building settlements, homes, or even entire towns on dry river beds, or what are locally known in many areas as nala. These are natural seasonal watercourses. People observe these areas are dry for extended periods, maybe sometimes for years, between significant flows. They perceive them as available land, often prime real estate because it's flat, accessible, and maybe inexpensive compared to safer ground. So they proceed to construct homes, businesses, roads, entire colonies there, often, unfortunately, with official permits granted through negligence, corruption, or simply a lack of understanding or respect for hydrological realities. They essentially build right in the path of a future flood.
Ignoring the land's natural function.
Precisely. But when the heavy rains inevitably come, as nature's cycles dictate they eventually will, these dry riverbeds transform back into their natural intended function. They become flood pathways, designed to carry large volumes of water. The consequences are immediate, devastating, and frankly, entirely predictable to anyone who understands the environment. Homes are submerged, possessions are lost, lives are disrupted or tragically lost, infrastructure is destroyed, and major disasters unfold. This is presented as a direct, undeniable consequence of ignoring nature's design, a result of our past errors in judgment, our short-sighted planning or lack thereof, and a collective disregard for fundamental environmental principles. It's not nature punishing us, it's nature simply following its established course, a course which we, through our actions, have chosen to obstruct or occupy.
That's a very stark and clear example of immediate localized consequences. So, facing these kinds of devastating outcomes, what's the path forward, according to the source? Is it just to suffer helplessly, clean up, and maybe rebuild in the same spot? Or is there a more proactive, intelligent approach outlined?
The source outlines two fundamental ways humanity tends to deal with this kind of situation, this clash with natural laws. One way is to simply suffer the consequences reactively, to allow nature to relentlessly carve its own path, often with destructive force because we have defied its immutable laws. We endure the flood, the fire, the storm, lament the loss, maybe receive some aid, and then often, tragically, repeat the same mistakes. This is the reactive, painful path of learned helplessness, or perhaps just inertia. The second, and obviously presented as the more intelligent, responsible, and sustainable path, is to actively seek to understand nature's design, to recognize its inherent patterns, its delicate balances, its established laws, both physical and perhaps the source implies, subtle or divine. And then, armed with that understanding, to consciously align ourselves with those principles. This means respecting ecological boundaries, planning our cities and settlements intelligently, implementing sustainable practices in agriculture and industry, managing resources wisely. The crucial focus must shift towards future prevention. It must be about learning deeply from our mistakes and taking concrete, systemic corrective action, rather than just lamenting the past after a disaster strikes. Or even worse, simply rebuilding in the same vulnerable areas without addressing the root causes.
So, this isn't just a recent phenomenon, this challenge of humanity grappling with the consequences of going against nature, or perhaps defying universal laws. Are there deeper historical parallels mentioned for humanity facing severe consequences for such actions?
Yes, very much so. The source doesn't present this as a uniquely modern problem, although perhaps the scale and frequency are intensifying now. It powerfully reminds us of the historical, almost archetypal parallel of Noah's Ark, the story of the Tufaninu, or Noah's flood, as recounted in various religious traditions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam. That catastrophic event, as depicted in sacred texts, is generally interpreted as coming about precisely because people at that time were actively and collectively going against nature, against divine laws, against the fundamental moral and natural order of existence. Their actions, their choices, their societal norms created conditions that, according to the narrative, led to an inevitable and overwhelming natural consequence, the flood. The underlying message, applicable across time, is clear. The consequence of persistently clashing with nature, of stubbornly defying its fundamental principles, whether we understand them as physical laws or divine commands, is an immutable law in itself. Nature, or the system of reality, will eventually assert its dominance, often with catastrophic outcomes for those societies or individuals who refuse to align with it. This isn't presented as arbitrary punishment from a vengeful deity, but rather as the inexorable unfolding of cause and effect, where persistent defiance leads to a predetermined, unavoidable result built into the system itself.
That really drives home the point about the need for collective awareness and perhaps some urgent, significant changes in how we operate. The source mentions we see floods almost every year in some regions. How has our response evolved, or maybe more critically, failed to evolve, according to the source, in the face of these recurring disasters? It seems like we should be learning faster.
That's a critical point the source raises. If we connect this to the bigger picture, particularly in certain regions mentioned implicitly, we've been hearing about major devastating floods becoming an almost annual event. particularly since major geological events like the 2005 earthquake might have altered landscapes, followed by the severe floods in 2006. It's become a recurring, almost predictable pattern in the monsoon season. Yet, despite this predictability, instead of implementing lasting systemic solutions based on understanding the altered hydrology and ecological realities, we often seem to exacerbate the problem through repeated missteps or inaction. The source specifically highlights the Lainula in Rawalpindi as a prime, tragic example of this societal failure in planning and adaptation. Over decades, people have built extensively and often illegally or with questionable permissions right along its banks, encroaching deeply into its natural floodplain. During the dry seasons, it's often treated like a mere drain or neglected channel, its natural watercourse constricted, filled with waste, and built over. But when the heavy monsoons arrive, as they predictably do every year, it rapidly swells, transforming instantly from a neglected drain into a raging, destructive river that sweeps away homes, bridges, infrastructure, and tragically lives. We then see cries for help, blame is assigned, temporary relief efforts are mounted. But the original mistakes, the illegal encroachment, the short-sighted urban planning that allowed it, the failure to respect the natural watercourse, the lack of investment in proper flood mitigation upstream, these root causes are often forgotten or conveniently ignored until the next disaster inevitably strikes.
So we have official government departments like planning and development specifically tasked with preventing these things, but the source suggests their efforts often remain largely on paper without effective, sustained implementation on the ground. This points to a deeper systemic issue, doesn't it? More than just individual mistakes.
That's precisely the challenge highlighted, and it serves as a critical indictment of the gap between policy and practice. The source points out the irony that a formal planning and development department, P&D, exists within government structures, theoretically mandated to foresee potential problems, plan development sustainably, and prevent such predictable disasters. Yet, time and again, their plans, however well-intentioned they might be on paper, often fail to translate into effective, enforced, and sustained implementation on the ground. Regulations are bypassed, encroachments continue, infrastructure isn't maintained or upgraded adequately. This leaves the public, especially the most vulnerable communities often living in these high-risk areas, to repeatedly suffer the devastating consequences of this systemic negligence, lack of political will, and poor governance. It indicates a profound disconnect between planning and execution, and perhaps a lack of collective will extending from individuals ignoring warnings all the way up to institutions failing to enforce sustainable practices. And what's truly fascinating here, in a central recurring theme from the source material's perspective, is the emphasis on the immutability of divine or natural laws. You simply reap what you sow. It's presented as an unbreakable cosmic principle. If you plant thorns, you will eventually get thorns. If you plant roses, you will eventually get roses. There is no escaping this universal law of cause and effect, whether it applies to a single seed planted in a garden or the collective choices and actions of an entire civilization over decades. The consequences eventually manifest.
So the solution then, in the face of these grave recurring consequences, lies in a fundamental shift. A shift that has to start at the individual level, but then must expand outwards to influence society, governance, and our collective relationship with the environment.
Exactly. That's the path forward presented. The solution begins with individuals correcting themselves. This is the first, absolutely vital step, a process of self-assessment, taking personal responsibility, recognizing one's own role, however small, in the collective mistakes, whether through action or inaction. Then, individuals who gain this awareness have a responsibility to share it with others, gently, wisely, encouraging a broader shift in mindset. A shift away from purely individual benefit, short-term gain, and unchecked self-preservation towards a perspective that values collective well-being, long-term sustainability, and living in harmony with natural laws. It's not about abandoning one's own legitimate needs or well-being entirely, of course. It's about leaving, as the source puts it, the sole, isolated pursuit of personal gain at the expense of the whole. It's about integrating one's own prosperity and actions into the larger societal and ecological good. Going back to the analogy, it's about consciously choosing not to allow the individual sugar grain to remain isolated, hard, and heavy at the bottom, but actively allowing it, choosing for it, to dissolve and sweeten the whole solution. Without this fundamental shift in mindset, starting individually and spreading collectively, the cycle of mistakes, ecological defiance, denial, and dire consequences will inevitably continue, trapping us in a heavy, self-inflicted burden, the shakal of our own making.
And it's important, I think, to reiterate the clarification you made earlier that from this perspective, this isn't about divine punishment in some angry retributive sense, but about facing the natural, perhaps pre-programmed outcomes or results of our actions, more like cosmic justice or simply cause and effect rather than arbitrary wrath.
Yes, that's a crucial distinction the source seems to emphasize. When we talk about law or divine law in this context, it's important to understand that the perspective offered is not one of a law punishing, in the human sense of arbitrary vengeance, anger, or retribution for perceived wrongdoing. Rather, the outcomes we face, whether they manifest as natural disasters, societal breakdowns, economic hardships, or even personal misfortunes, are presented as the direct results or consequences flowing naturally from our actions, both individually and collectively. Divine laws, natural laws, they are established, immutable, consistent, and ultimately perfectly just in their operation. If we defy them, if we act against the established natural or moral order, we inevitably experience the predetermined results of those actions. It's a matter of inbuilt cause and effect. Our choices lead to predictable outcomes within the system, outcomes which we then, perhaps from our limited human perspective, might perceive or label as punishment or reward. But the underlying principle is presented as a universal, impartial law of consequence, not the intervention of a fickle or reactive deity.
Okay. This provides a lot of context for understanding our current situation. Now, let's discuss a concept that feels like it beautifully ties all of this together, Qalb Salim. Uku. We've talked about understanding nuanced spiritual terms like Basharat and Nazeer, the deeper meanings hidden in Mutashabihat, the importance of collective thought over individual shakal, and the need to face the consequences of our collective actions. What exactly is a sound heart, Qalb Salim, in this context, and how does it perhaps bring all these powerful ideas together into a practical path forward for us as individuals and communities?
That's a great place to bring things together. Qalb means heart, as most listeners probably know, and Salim comes from the same root as Islam and Taslim. It means one who accepts, submits, is sound, whole, or at peace. So a Qalb Salim, a sound heart, is far more than just a heart that intellectually believes in something or agrees that something is true. It's a heart that not only acknowledges the truth intellectually, but truly accepts it deep within, Taslim, embraces it, and then crucially, consistently acts upon what it believes and has accepted. Many people, maybe most of us, hear profound truths perhaps from the Quran or from the teachings of wise guides like Murshid Karim, or even just good ethical counsel, and we might believe it to be true in our minds. We nod along, we agree intellectually, yes, that sounds right. But a Qalb Salim goes significantly further. It possesses the inner inclination, the driving passion, what the source beautifully describes using the Urdu words zok or shok, which implies a deep taste, a yearning, an enthusiastic longing to actually test that truth in their own lives, to seek to experience its reality directly, not just read about it.
And most importantly, to act upon it consistently, day in and day out, making it a living, breathing part of their character and behavior. So it's really an attitude. It's a dynamic, lived practice, a state of being where belief translates seamlessly into action. It's not just an abstract intellectual concept or a passive dormant belief sitting in the mind. It's about actively bridging that often wide gap between knowing what's right and actually doing what's right.
Okay, so it's really about internalizing the values, making them a core part of one's character, one's instinctive way of being, rather than just acknowledging them intellectually or, giving them lip service when it's convenient. Can you give us a tangible, everyday example of what that looks like in practical life? Something beyond grand spiritual quest, maybe something in the family or community setting?
The source provides a wonderful, very relatable example that most parents, or frankly, anyone who observes family dynamics closely, can probably identify with quite easily. Consider how children, and sometimes adults too, often interact within the family unit versus how they interact with outsiders. They might frequently bicker, be ill-mannered, disrespectful, or demanding with family members at home, perhaps with siblings, parents, or grandparents. There's often a lack of courtesy. Yet these same individuals can be remarkably polite, well-behaved, considerate, and gracious when interacting with outsiders, friends, teachers, guests, even strangers. They put on their best behavior.
Yeah.
Now, almost every parent wishes this wasn't the case. They wish their children would show the same courtesy at home. But many parents don't quite know how to effectively change this ingrained pattern of behavior beyond just ordering or scolding, which often doesn't work long term.
Right, that's a common frustration. So how would a parent aiming to cultivate Qalb Salim in their children and perhaps in their home environment generally approach the specific situation differently, more effectively?
A parent consciously working towards Qalb Salim in themselves and their children
wouldn't just lament the behavior or resort solely to commands or punishments, which often create resentment rather than understanding. Instead, they would reason with their children, appealing to their innate sense of fairness and goodness, not just command them. They might sit them down at a calm moment and say something along these lines, with sincerity and genuine love, not accusation. "My dear child, I notice you are so wonderfully polite and well-mannered when you're with your friends or when guests come over. You say please and thank you. You listen respectfully. You share nicely. That makes me so happy to see. Why then do you sometimes act rudely or speak disrespectfully to your own family, to your brother, your sister, your mother, your father, the people who love you the most in this world, who care for you constantly, who are always here for you? Don't you think it is even more essential, even more beautiful and important to be well-mannered, kind, and considerate with your own people, with those closest to you? Because they are your foundation, your support system, your innermost circle. Showing them respect and kindness is the most important kindness of all."
So it's appealing to their understanding and their heart, not just demanding obedience.
Exactly. When children or adults genuinely accept this logic, when their hearts submit to the inherent truth and fairness of this reasoning, when they truly understand its value, not just intellectually, but emotionally, and then they actually make a conscious effort to practice it at home, when they start making that consistent effort to be polite, kind, and considerate within their family, catching themselves when they slip, trying again, that is the process of developing a Qalbi Salim. It's the consistent, conscious effort to embody the truth they've understood and accepted, moving it from intellectual agreement or parental pressure into active, habitual practice. And this transformation, inevitably, starts to sweeten the whole home environment, replacing the friction of individual shakal with the harmony of collective consideration.
That's incredibly insightful and practical.
Yeah.
So it really boils down to internalizing and living the values, embodying them, making them a part of one's very character, rather than just acknowledging them intellectually or performing them for an external audience. And it starts right there, in the most immediate environment, the home, the family.
Exactly. And the source draws another parallel. We might often admire, for example, the surface-level politeness observed in many Western societies, where phrases like "thank you," "please," "excuse me," and "sorry" are very common, almost instinctive reflexes in public interactions. From the perspective of Qalbi Salim, one could argue they have not only realized or understood the social utility and ethical value of these courteous behaviors for smooth social functioning, but crucially, they've also diligently practiced them, generation after generation, until they became deeply ingrained societal habits, almost second nature for many. That represents a form of collective Qalbi Salim in action, at least in that specific aspect of public manners. Now compare that to situations where we might praise good ideas, beautiful ethics, or profound spiritual concepts. We talk about them, we admire them, maybe we even lecture others about them, but we consistently fail to act on them ourselves. If we don't bring these values actively into our own homes, our workplaces, our daily interactions, our communities, then it just remains mere talk. It's empty words, knowledge, without amal, action, and it doesn't truly transform us or our environment.
The knowledge remains theoretical, not embodied.
Precisely. Our homes, for instance, as the source suggests, are often filled with underlying discontent, irritation, friction, and a lack of genuine cordiality. Precisely because individualistic thinking, everyone stuck in their own shakal, like those undissolved sugar grains, prevails. Each person remains focused on their own needs, their own perspective, their own justification, demanding their own way. But if collective thought, good manners, mutual respect, and consideration were genuinely practiced, if a collective Qalbi Salim began to permeate the household, then even occasional rudeness or thoughtlessness from one person could potentially be corrected, not necessarily by direct confrontation or argument, but by the consistent, unwavering good behavior, patience, and positive examples set by the others. It creates a positive ripple effect that can gradually transform the atmosphere. It's about proactively sweetening the atmosphere through conscious action rooted in accepted values, rather than just passively suffering its bitterness or complaining about it.
This truly ties everything together beautifully, doesn't it? From the profound interpretation of seemingly obscure scriptural terms, right down to our most basic daily interactions within our families and communities. Qalbi Salim, the sound heart, isn't some lofty, unattainable spiritual state reserved only for saints or prophets. It emerges as an attitude, a practical way of being that needs to be consciously cultivated moment by moment in every individual and every home if we truly want to transform society from the ground up. It's about making our inner beliefs, our accepted truths, manifest clearly and consistently in our outer actions. It's about becoming living examples of the wisdom we claim to understand. It feels like the ultimate, so what, the practical application derived from all our discussions today.
Indeed, it really is the practical manifestation of integrated faith and wisdom. It's the point where knowledge meets action, where understanding transforms behavior. It's about choosing to be that dissolved sugar, constantly contributing our sweetness to the whole rather than remaining a stagnant, isolated, perhaps even bitter grain stuck at the bottom. And the empowering message is that if we can start cultivating this qalbi salim, this soundness, this integrity, this harmony between belief and action in our own lives, starting within ourselves, then extending it to our own homes, and then radiating it outwards into our communities, then we can truly begin to address the collective mistakes we've discussed. We can transform the mutashabihat of divine wisdom from confusing allegories into clear Muhkamat guiding principles lived out in our lives. And maybe, just maybe, we can start building a more harmonious, just, considerate, and spiritually evolved world, one sound heart at a time. It really challenges each of us, doesn't it? Not just to know the good, but to actively become the good, to embody the change we wish to see in the world around us.
We are very thankful to you for listening to us. Please subscribe to this channel, Melody of Divine, like the video, and comment, as your comments matter to us a lot.